let's do our next. Yeah, you know what? I said I would last week. Let's do it. Let's do our next episode of the draft this week. And we have moved on to writing, haven't we? So, writing the first draft, part one, from Benji's perspective, how Benji does it. Let's go for it. So, at this point, right, we've talked about how I've mapped out the whole movie in card format on index cards, right? Another thing that I do with the cards is I put down the wants, the want opposed on the back of the card. I try to do a want and opposed breakdown kind of thing, where it's like, here's the character that wants something in this scene, and then here's the character trying to keep that from happening in the scene. And they're like, back and forth is our scene. It's how you figure out what the beats are of each scene and what you're building towards and how you want each scene to end and who wins the scene. In a way, every character wins a scene, beats somebody else, right? In a way. Unless it's very character driven. Maybe it's character development that the scene's focusing on. And that's a little different, but that's still, the character could be battling himself in a scene. And it's still, it'd be two sides of a character battling each other. Which one wins? It's still, it's always kind of how scenes are. Scenes are very beat to beat, building to a specific moment that then pushes the story forward a little more. At the end of every scene, you should have some kind of change. It can be the slightest bit. It's either character centric, plot centric, or it could be character development, or it could be just basic moving the plot forward, or just revealing some story information that's important. It just has to, every scene has to serve a purpose, obviously. But yeah, I just always do that on the back of the cards, just to help when I get into it. But here's how I do first drafts, because it always, for me, makes the most sense to start doing the real work in the second draft. And that's because I have this big, giant story in my head, right? I have all this stuff that kind of just needs to come out. And because if I don't get it out, it'll just kind of distract me later. I'll be like writing the second draft maybe, and I didn't do this stuff, and I'll be like, oh, maybe I should do this then. It's like, no, this way it's already, all the shit's been cleaned out, kind of. I just let it flow. When I write a first draft, I let it flow. I write whatever the fuck I possibly thought of doing for this movie, in this scene, in this sequence, in this, the whole thing. I just write the whole thing however the fuck I want, without really thinking too deeply about whether or not it's supposed to go a certain way, or if the specificity of it's adding up, or like some logistical things. If the dialogue is perfect, I don't get into that yet. I write the worst possible version of the movie first, so that later I can write the actual movie. And this is not everybody. This is, believe me, people will write a scene, not move on to the next one until that scene is 100% perfect. And I've tried it that way, and I sometimes do that in the first draft. I will spend on certain scenes a lot more time than on other certain scenes. Usually specifically my plot points, because they're the ones I've been thinking about the most at this point. You should be at least. You start with those. I'd like to know how it ends, how it begins, and the two biggest moments that get us from the beginning to the end, in the middle-ish of the movie, right? Those plot points are the most important, so they get a lot more time spent on them in any draft when I'm writing. But every scene is important. Every scene you write, so of course, at some point or another, you're going to have to, you sit down and you do the work. Every scene, every little detail matters. Everything has to be specific, has to have a purpose. But when it comes to the first draft, I do literally just card. What happens in it? Write it. Who's in it? what happens, and just go. How do I see it? How I'd see it cinematically in my head, and just try to just action and dialogue this thing through all the way to the end. And what happens every time that I write a first draft is I write too much. That's a good problem to have, though. You don't want to be. It's harder to be the one who doesn't have enough to write. I always have too much to write. Too much comes out. Project I'm working on right now, the longest first draft I've ever written. Before that, the longest first draft I ever wrote was 170 pages long. So that just tells you how long this first draft. You can take a guess how long this first draft was. But I'll keep talking about it as we go forward. Next week I will continue to talk about how I do certain writing things in the first draft and whatnot on the next episode of the draft.